In disaster scenarios, 89% of Europeans would expect to rely upon a family member or friend, while 81% would expect help to come from the emergency services. Now, what that tells me is that over here, not a lot of people are preparing. In my last video that went low-key viral, I briefly explained the situation that I am in as a British guy living in Europe, and I've linked that in the description below if you haven't already seen it. The reaction to that video was really encouraging because I will happily admit it to myself and to the camera now, I wasn't quite sure if I was ready to publicly discuss the idea of prepping. And now the video's had something like 25,000 views. I've got 1,000 new subscribers on the channel. And what has been fantastic is to be able to connect with some like-minded people here on YouTube, which is really refreshing. So if you haven't already, please do subscribe and also drop a like on this video because I would love to continue making these. So here in Europe, the idea of prepping as a topic isn't openly discussed, but this video is on your feed and you're watching it because you have come around to the idea of building your skills and probably your preps too. But let me ask you, how much of that information is from the USA or Canada? While the basic principle of prepping is the same everywhere, which is building up skills, your supplies and your gear to get you through that disaster situation, I've come to appreciate the need to look at things on a much more local level too. Now, through some very basic online research, I discovered that 2/3 of Europeans express the need and the desire to get more information and learn more about the idea of disaster and emergency preparedness. And a majority of around 70% of people trust public authorities for their information. Now, as a Brit with an understanding of institutions and the media in the UK, I have absolutely no idea how people could use that as a trusted source of information. Now, I'm not sure how much this statistic differs to North America, but only about 29% of people over here have any food and drink stockpiled. And just 20% of people have any ability to source emergency water. And some of the comments in my last video also voiced their opinions how talking about prepping isn't something you do openly here in Europe. And this is a real shame because the way I see it, it's less about buying ammo and defending yourself and more about building life skills. Things that you would learn at Boy Scouts or out camping with your dad. That does remind me though, one time when I was in Texas, I was 18 or 19, I was invited to come out on a deer hunt. And at the time that really scared me and I chose not to go. However, now it's one of the only things in my life that I regret not doing because I think I respect that the idea of that hunt was to go out and put food on the table of all the families involved. We can just nip into the supermarket for a pack of venison, right? That experience could have been the most genuine introduction to functional hunting that I would ever have got. But coming from England, I have my guard up. Hunting over there is just something that's not publicly accepted at all. And it's that sort of localized exposure or differences that at least I hope to be able to challenge on this YouTube channel. Now, I think there are a lot of differences between North America and Europe and kind of the topic of prepping. And for me, one of the most exciting things about the idea of prepping for me is food. I think here in Europe, we've got some wonderful cuisines from all the different countries. A lot of that does use fresh produce, but I think there are going to be ways of getting around that. My ideas when it comes to building up supplies of food is to definitely have some things in there that are going to act as morale boosters, something to share with your friends, your family. I'm thinking a good bottle of whiskey for sure, preserved olives, that sort of thing. So shortly after finishing my food, this huge storm just rolled in, so I've moved to the other side of the valley here to get away from that. And I will continue talking about the cultural differences in what sort of prepper you could be. Now, there are different areas that you could be looking into. Each one comes with their own stereotyping from the outside, but it's that sort of opinion that we're trying to not let creep in, because ultimately that's going to stop you being the sort of prepper that you want to be. Here in Spain, prepping is becoming increasingly viewed as a practical response to uncertainty. And that's mainly due to the hard lockdowns that we had during the pandemic. Family relationships are incredibly tight here, so anyone prepping is doing so with more than one person in mind. And with the thanks to the quite low cost of living here, it's very easy to add on extra items to any food shop without it being financially a burden on you. The types of threats here that people are concerned about are mostly surrounding the climate. For example, the drought that we've been in for the last number of years, but more on that in a moment. Now, up in Finland, for example, different concerns are on the mind of the general public. They share a 1,300 kilometre border with Russia. So naturally, with what's going on with the war in Ukraine, there are different concerns and worries. For example, national security issues. Finnish preppers often emphasise community and social networks, viewing collaboration as essential for survival. This collective approach contrasts quite drastically with the individualistic approach that we often see elsewhere. And in Germany, prepping is sometimes associated with a lack of faith in the government. And in Sweden and Denmark, residents often prioritise cybersecurity and digital preparedness as key areas that they focus on. So to go back to my earlier point about looking at things on more of a local level when it comes to deciding what sort of things you need to do with regards to prepping, you just need to look at something as simple like the difference in climate that we have from the very south of Europe to the very north. And there are many key areas that you could choose to niche down into to get a greater awareness of how things work or how things grow. Types of preppers in Europe include your survivalists who go out there to acquire key skills and knowledge on how to survive in adverse conditions. This might look like outdoor training and self-reliance. And here in Spain, for example, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a 30% increase in people that wanted to do some sort of survival course after that. Now, this is something that's quite new for me, despite having used computers for more than 2 decades and running an online business, and that is the technological preparedness. And these sort of people focus on threats such as cybersecurity and data protection, which is something that actually affects us all. They are preparing themselves and are concerned about digital threats, which could impact personal or confidential information and infrastructure. Urban preppers or city preppers encounter a different set of problems, such as power outages, food shortages, or competition with so many people living within such close proximity of each other. While on the contrast to that, rural preppers are more engaged in things like gardening, hunting, or keeping livestock. Now, the latter is more of the dream for people when it comes to that idea of bugging out. But unless you're here already living rurally, then you're going to be much better off focusing your time and attention to see what things might pose a threat to you on that local level and turning your time and attention to finessing skills there. And I'm genuinely interested. Please let me know in the comments what sort of local concerns you have and where you would be choosing to bug out initially. Now, let me summarize with an experience that I have had for the first time in my life. Here in the Iberian Peninsula, we've been in a drought for the last 3 to 4 years, and limits on our water supply were put into place last summer. And that's something I never expected I would have to deal with. Now, although up here where I live in the Pyrenees, it looks really nice and green and lush right now, we have just had a record period of reduced rainfall and snowfall. That lack of a snowcap that we had meant that in spring, when the runoff started, it didn't fill up the rivers and the reservoirs. And the little rain that did come needed to be split up and allocated to the big cities that we have, such as Barcelona and Madrid, but also across the extensive agriculture network here in Spain. Reservoirs up here in Catalonia are in a terrible state. And in fact, the closest one to me, which is the supplier of much of Barcelona's water, went down to below 10%. And actually, that reminds me, there was even a program in place where the authorities were rescuing all the fish and moving them elsewhere to stop the population from crashing. Now the situation is thankfully much better, thanks to a very, very wet and cold winter, and the skiing was fantastic. However, look at this map of Q1 of 2025. It shows all that rain that fell in the Iberian Peninsula, and little to none up in the north. Now the topic of drought has just moved up into Germany and the UK, which is a big concern. So the big question, is Europe ready for preppers? I think the headlines should be something more like, finally, Europe's prepping. Now, I genuinely am interested in this community, so please let me know in the comments what sort of local concerns you might have. If you are enjoying this European prepping content, then please do like and subscribe, and join me in my next videos where I'll be looking at my preps for food, gear, and skills.